welcome to this Introduction to Research Inclusion at the NIHR session. My name's Alana Wilde. I am a Research Inclusion Manager working nationally across the NIHR, and my pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with longish brown hair, a silver nose ring, and I've got a grey jumper on today. I'm going to pass across to Nikki and let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Hopkins. I'm also one of the Research Inclusion Managers that works across NIHR. My pronouns are also she, her. I'm a white woman, just about in my 30s with brown hair.
So Nikki's going to get us started today, and then I will come back in later on.
Okay, so the plan for today is to firstly go over some of the key terminology that you might hear in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, as well as doing a little bit of a refresher on what the law says. So we'll cover the Equality Act 2010, as well as touching on the protected characteristics protected under the Act, and then mentioning some other characteristics that NIHR is particularly interested in. We'll then very quickly touch on the NIHR's research inclusion strategy that runs from 2022 to 2027. It's probably useful for you to understand what we mean by the term research inclusion. So this is the name that we use for the programme of work, including equality, diversity and inclusion, based at the NIHR. So when we're talking about research inclusion, we're talking about our programme of work. Lastly, we'll talk about EDI in practice, and we'll cover topics like microaggressions, bias, the importance of inclusive language, and then creating inclusive practice in relationships. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at terminology and the legal context. So firstly, we hear equality, diversity and inclusion a lot. We hear the term EDI as a sort of a catch-all often. And those three terms can start to sort of lose their meaning, but they are three distinct terms. So we're going to go through those first on this slide. So when we think about equality, this is about ensuring everyone's given equal access, excuse me, to resources and opportunities to utilise their skills and talents. So taking a systems approach to what we do and how we do it, and identifying and removing long-standing structural barriers to success. Importantly, equality doesn't mean a one-size-fits-all approach. There are specific structural barriers which affect different groups of individuals, and equality means being aware of these specifics and working to provide an environment where they are removed. Another related term is equity, and this refers to how we recognise that different groups face different barriers and so need different support to overcome them. For example, to enable people with visual impairments to consider participation in your research, you may need to provide participants information sheets in an alternative format. Next, we consider diversity. So when we think about diversity, we're thinking about the who. So it could refer to people who are involved in your research team, different people in your workplace, or any other relevant group, and what their background might be. So for NIHR, diversity means that we're reflective of the wider community, and our goal is to have a diverse community with people from a broad range of backgrounds represented in all areas and at all levels. And finally, this brings me to inclusion. So inclusion is taking an approach where groups or individuals with different backgrounds are welcomed, culturally and socially accepted and treated equally. Inclusion means engaging with each person as an individual. It's ensuring a sense of belonging that is respectful of people for who they are. I think it's also important for us to understand the difference between equality and equity, because these words are used sometimes interchangeably. So even though they don't really mean the same thing. So we've got a graphic on the next slide, which will be really helpful and show the difference between those two terms. But equity essentially means that we're trying to understand and give people what they need to achieve their potential. And it promotes notions of fairness, justice, entitlements, and rights. Equity might mean that not everyone is treated in exactly the same way, but it really exemplifies that sense of treating everyone as an individual and recognising that what they need to succeed might not be the same for you or I in the same situation. And lastly, in terms of our terminology, we've got reasonable adjustments. So this might be a term that you're familiar with. You might have heard it in a workplace setting. But reasonable adjustments or access needs can really apply to any process or standard way of doing things. So we've put the definition here, which does come from the workplace context, which explains reasonable adjustments as being a change to an ordinary process, which makes sure individuals who are disabled or who have a physical or mental health condition are not substantially disadvantaged by those ordinary processes when it comes to their role. Okay, so thinking back to equality and equity, this diagram is one that you might have come across before. It was developed by the Interaction Institute for Social Change. So on the left-hand side of the picture, we can see that there are 3 individuals of different heights and they're all standing on the same size box. They're all trying to watch a game of football. The taller individual, not football, sorry, it's baseball, isn't it? The taller individual can easily see over the fence, even without the box. But this image looks at equality in quite literal terms. So all 3 people shown have exactly the same box to stand on. And that's fine for the person that could already see over the fence. And it also works for the individual in the middle, who can now just about see over the fence, now they're on the box. But the smallest of the 3 figures, even with the same size box as everyone else, still can't see the game. So on the right-hand side, the boxes have been redistributed. So the person who didn't need it in the first place because they could already see doesn't have a box anymore because they could already see over the fence. So the individual in the middle's kept their box because that means they can still see over the fence. And the difference in this image is that the furthest right person who couldn't see, even with the single box, now has an extra box so they can see too. And this depicts equity, but it's actually what we're commonly talking about at the NIHR when we use the word equality. And the difference between giving everyone the exact same support versus recognising that different people require different assistance to have the same access is integral to making sure that equality, diversity and inclusion improve the access that individuals have to NIHR. Okay, so who does our work focus on then? This next part of the session is going to cover legislation. And it's really important to go over this, even if it's information that you've heard lots of times before. So the Equality Act of 2010 lists 9 protected characteristics, and they're protected under the law from various kinds of injustice or discrimination. Those characteristics are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race and ethnicity, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And what the law says is, in essence, that individuals have a right to fair treatment and access, and that not given that fair treatment or access because of discrimination associated with any of these characteristics is unlawful. It's also really important to note that when we have a combination of these characteristics, often we think about them in isolation. So we might focus on sex or ethnicity, for example, as though they exist in a vacuum. But the combinations of these characteristics that we possess can affect how we experience the world and how we experience barriers to participation, or in some cases, increased discrimination. Intersectionality recognises that for minoritised groups, having multiple marginalised identities or multiple protected characteristics, so being a Black woman, for example, can mean that the barriers you face are compounded. Okay, so we've touched on the 9 protected characteristics, but on how we're using them in the EDI space. Before we move on, we want to briefly mention some of the other characteristics that we're interested in the research inclusion space. And the reason we're interested in these characteristics is because they can have implications for health and for health inequalities. So the 3 additional things that we focus on at NIHR are socioeconomic status, geographical location, and access to healthcare. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off my part of this session by thinking about talking about what NIHR is doing in the research inclusion space. So our aims in research in relation to research inclusion are set out in the NIHR's first research inclusion strategy, which we launched in 2022 and runs until 2027. We're trying to ensure that we build momentum for positive change in EDI, and that we're fostering an inclusive environment where we engage the talents and energy of a diverse group of people. And we also want to improve the relevance and quality of research and to elicit a culture of continuous learning and improvement. To deliver these aims in our strategy, we've organised it around 5 key themes. So firstly, theme 1, to become an inclusive funder of research. Theme 2 is to widen access and participation for greater diversity and inclusion. Theme 3 is to improve and invest in the NIHR talent pipeline. Theme 4 is to embed an evidence-led approach, an evidence-led diversity and inclusion approach. And theme 5 is to collaborate with partners for impact and sustainability. So we also published our action plan, which accompanies the strategy, and that sets out some of our key projects that will take us through to 2027. So to give you some sort of idea or feel for these projects, we've been looking at improving our approach to how we monitor diversity data, which allows us to understand where groups might be underrepresented among NIHR's research community. We've also been developing NIHR's disability framework. We've published some aspirational targets for our committees and panels, and we've been collaborating with others across the sector to ensure we're taking a joined-up approach to our EDI work. So these partnerships include with organisations such as Melanin Medics, the NHS Race and the Health Observatory, and a cross-funder group looking at reducing bullying and harassment in research. We've also worked with other funders and organisations in the sector to develop a statement of intent for our approach to sex and gender, recognising the importance of research taking into account these characteristics going forward. So that's a brief summary of some of the work that we're doing at the moment. And I'm going to hand over to Alana now. Take us through the next part.
Thanks, Nikki. So yeah, I'm going to now talk to you about sort of equality, diversity and inclusion in practice. So we're going to go over some sort of tips for working inclusively and think about pitfalls and ways that people quite often get it wrong. So the purpose of this section is, as I say, get you thinking about these different topics that are related to creating an inclusive environment. So we're going to touch on 5 topics, all very, very briefly, just to give you an introduction to the various concepts. So I'm going to look at microaggressions, inclusive language, navigating difficult or challenging conversations, bias and stereotype, and creating an inclusive space. So to jump right in, microaggressions. So a microaggression is a subtle slight or action that leaves people from a minoritized group normally feeling upset, offended or uncomfortable. And quite often, speakers aren't aware that they've caused offence. And this lack of awareness or lack of knowledge that you've offended someone is really, really important, because you don't need to intend to offend or upset somebody to sort of perpetrate a microaggression. You might not be aware of the impact of what you're saying. So I've got 3 examples on this slide of microaggressions, and I'm going to quickly touch on each one and talk a little bit about what can cause offence. So one relates to disability, the other to age, and the other quite often to ethnicity or nationality. So if you think back to the protected characteristics that Nikki was referring to, there's 3 protected characteristics here. As I say, we're going to quickly look at sort of what's harmful about each one of them. Quite often, it's important to note some of these might be used in an attempt at humour. And just to reiterate, if you've ever said any of these things before, it isn't the case that you necessarily intended to cause offence, or even that you did. This is just to make you aware of sort of how sentences like this can offend people. So let's start with the way you've achieved so much despite your disability is inspiring. And this might seem like you'd be complimenting someone, right? So the reason that this is given as an example of a microaggression is because it rests on an underlying assumption that disabled people are less capable or less likely to achieve things than a non-disabled person might. So it might, of course, be the case that you genuinely want to recognise someone's achievements or to celebrate their achievements. But if you're doing that, you needn't mention a person's disability or impairment or link that impairment to the achievement. So you can totally say what you've achieved is inspiring, but you needn't link that to the disability or the impairment itself. So the problematic part of this statement is mainly this sense of despite a disability and the combination of the mentioning of that disability with the use of inspiration. Second statement is maybe more clearly problematic, and it's not only a microaggression, it could be considered ageism too, but hopefully you can see how this might be said in quite a jovial way, although that doesn't necessarily make it less harmful. So do you even know what TikTok is at your age? Rests on an assumption that older people are less likely to be familiar with current trends, especially where they relate to technology. And it's just not true. Then lastly, we've got an example of giving somebody a nickname because you struggle to pronounce their name. And while not always, this is quite often something that's experienced by individuals from an ethnic minority background. And our names quite often have meaning, heritage, and a real sense of identity contained within them. And by choosing to nickname somebody because it's easier for you, rather than allowing them to tell you what they'd prefer to be called, takes that away. And there's lots of really good campaigns now surrounding pronunciation of names, such as Race Equality Matters' My Name Is campaign, which encourages thinking about phonetic pronunciation of all names. And campaigns like this encourage asking if you're not sure how to pronounce a name, apologising if you don't get it right the first time, but being committed to learning how to pronounce certain names rather than just defaulting to nicknames. So they're the examples of microaggressions, and hopefully that's helped you to see why some of these things, even though they seem really, really innocuous, can cause offence. So we're going to move on to look at inclusive language. So power imbalances in working relationships can affect how people communicate. And so setting standards or trying to communicate as inclusively as possible can mean checking both ways that people are comfortable with how information is conveyed and with the language that you're comfortable with. Now, inclusive language means very different things to different people, and understandably, that means there's quite often a lot of fear around the potential for getting it wrong. People don't want to say the wrong thing, but all you can do is inform yourself as much as possible and set norms in working relationships for communicating inclusively. So that could be, for some people, sharing your pronouns when you first meet somebody, normalising that sense of them being able to do so too if they want to. And that can remove the risk of misgendering somebody later down the line. It can also relate to thinking about what the implications or connotations of words that you use are. So, for instance, it used to be quite commonplace to say that a wheelchair user was dependent on their wheelchair. Now, with the social model of disability becoming more commonly understood, we wouldn't use that dependent on. Instead, we use the phrase that I started with, which is wheelchair user, so that notion of dependency. Inclusive language can go beyond the words that we use as well. So this can be paying attention to requests that some people might have in their email signature that ask you to use a larger font when you're emailing them. Or it might be circulating something to your colleague a few days in advance of meeting with that colleague to give them time to look over content and maybe prepare questions in advance if that would be beneficial to them. And then my last point in relation to inclusive language is, if you're not sure, ask. So if you're beginning to work with someone new, you can open up a conversation about preferences and needs when it comes to communication. And that reduces the risk of communicating in ways that don't work for people or that people find particularly challenging. So we'll move on to navigating sensitive discussions. So everyone has these from time to time, and there's no one rule or one way to handle a sort of sensitive or challenging conversation. And it's really important to note that different people can find different techniques work for them when they're navigating sort of emotive topics, and different people react in different ways. So these conversations might be someone telling you or you letting someone know that the way you approach something made them uncomfortable. Or it could be more pastoral sorts of discussions where someone's experiencing a difficult time and they want to talk to you about it. So some sort of tips to make these conversations as inclusive as possible. First and foremost, try not to make assumptions or offer kind of unsolicited advice. So it's really, really easy, and we all have this natural inclination to want to help other people and to want to offer advice. But try to go into conversations like these with a very open mind. And instead of sort of jumping in and saying, oh, well, why don't we do this? You could say something like, how can I support you with this? Or, you know, what would you like to happen in this situation? When arranging sort of discussions that you think are likely to be emotive or challenging in some way, try to find a time that's distraction-free, where you can give your full attention to the person or the people that you're speaking to without being interrupted. I'm sure lots of us have had conversations where someone's sort of checking their emails at the same time as trying to talk to you, and you're not quite giving sort of 100% of your attention to the person that you're speaking with, and that can make it feel less like you're being taken seriously. Lastly, I've got on this bullet point, be empathetic and kind, and that's just a sort of way of approaching work in general, right? And if you find that conversations are becoming too much, it's absolutely okay always to say, can we pause this and come to it later on? And that can be if you're getting overwhelmed, or if you just don't feel like you're getting sort of productive discussion. And then I told you these would be quick introductions or quick summaries of these topics. Biases and stereotypes. So I'm going to talk very briefly about biases. In relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, you've probably heard the most about unconscious, or as it's sometimes known, implicit bias. But I want to start off by noting that all of us have biases. There's lots of different kinds of biases, and there's nothing inherently harmful about a bias. Some are positive. All our biases are affected by our own experiences and stereotypes that we rely on to help us process lots and lots of information very quickly. So our brains are constantly filtering out information or trying to process multiple stimuli at once. And so quite often what we rely on are known as heuristics in our thinking processes. And heuristics are almost like mental shortcuts that we fall back on. So when there's too much information for us to be able to sort of consider all of it at speed, we fall back on these stereotypes or unconscious beliefs that we hold about certain groups. And they can help us to assess the reliability of a piece of information or decide how seriously to take something without looking at all of the evidence objectively. So we all use these mental shortcuts to process information. The problem is that, as the slide here says, stereotypes and bias function almost like a lens through which we see the world. And some researchers at Harvard University, through a series of tests where subjects were asked to associate positive or negative words with images, found that we make faster associations when we're using these stereotypes, shortcuts, or relying on past experiences. Sometimes, as I said, they're not inherently harmful, but these quick judgments can often manifest in bias. And there's lots of different types of bias. So one is confirmation bias, which is our way of filtering out things that don't align with what we already believe to be true. So we can overlook important information by jumping to conclusions or paying more attention to facts that confirm what we already think than those which sort of run counter to what we already think. Unconscious bias tends to be talked about the most, and that's because there's lots of examples of unconscious bias manifesting in ways that perpetuate existing societal injustices and inequalities. So these can relate to things like educational background. So that might mean having underlying bias towards particular universities. They can also relate to accents, with the presumption, for example, that northern or regional accents in the UK imply that someone has a lower level of education. And quite often implicit bias can underpin racism. And that quite often works in tandem with false stereotypes about aggression. You might be wondering, if the bias is unconscious, how do we tackle it? And there's no one answer to that question. But research has found that slowing down, asking yourself whether you've considered all of the relevant information, can be helpful ways of identifying if you sort of relied on a stereotype, or you've made a judgment or are about to make a judgment that might be biased. In decision-making processes and reviews, you might consider removing identifying information. So we see this quite a lot in double or even triple blind peer reviews. And often a second opinion can help too. And that does mean being open to challenges or questions about what you've decided and how you've come to that decision. So in the resource section at the end, there's a few links to the implicit association test that I mentioned and some more reading on bias. So if anyone is interested in knowing more about these things, there's some links for you to go to. And then creating inclusive spaces. So this is the last topic that I'm going to touch on. And here I'm not necessarily talking about physical spaces, although maybe that's one element depending on the relationship or project that you're thinking about. So thinking about working inclusively means taking into consideration what you need, but also what others that you're interacting with need. And power, as I've mentioned in the inclusive language section, can play a big part in people feeling able to express their needs. So first and foremost, trying to create an environment that's inclusive means creating an environment where people feel able to be open and honest about how they need or prefer to receive information. So again, we've touched on this in the communications bit, but this can be as simple as expressing your own preferences and asking for theirs. So for instance, I know about myself, if I don't write something down, I'm going to forget it. And so if my manager is going to communicate something important to me, I'd much prefer they do that by email so that I can go back to it when I'm planning my projects. If I just sort of verbally agree to something, it's gone and it's not happening. But there's lots of different ways that people might need information communicating or might need you to adapt the way that you'd normally meet or share information. So again, I've mentioned this before, but this can look like sharing documents in advance or being open about when in the day works best for someone to have a meeting. It might also be a preference for in-person or virtual meetings if both are equally viable. Making sure that you're as present as possible in discussions, again, we've touched on this before, can help to create a space where people feel comfortable. So drawing on active listening, confirming what someone means if we're not sure, rather than just jumping to conclusions, can all be really useful ways of demonstrating that we are paying attention to the person that we're meeting with or talking to. And then there's also understanding needs and barriers. This could be relating again to communication, or it could be other things. So care and responsibilities, access to transport, fluctuating health conditions, etc., can all have impacts on individuals' energy and availability. And so trying to be open to what someone needs and feeling able to express that yourself is important, as is not jumping to conclusions if things change. So it could also relate to things like suggesting a coffee shop meeting if you both live close to one another. And this is something that, we do suggest quite a lot, but busy environments can be very overwhelming for some individuals, and they can be physically inaccessible or add a level of stress for others. So if that's something that you're thinking, oh, we could meet for a coffee, you might raise it, but ask whether the other person or individual is all right with that or would prefer to meet somewhere quieter, like a designated meeting room, or maybe even online. And then the last point that I want to touch on is this notion of opportunity and different ways of thinking, which is sometimes talked about in the sense of leveraging difference. And this is just about recognizing the opportunities presented by different viewpoints and different ways of approaching information. And there's a whole host of factors that affect how we all think. So if you think back to the bias slide, there's underlying assumptions, beliefs, and experiences. But there's also our culture, upbringings, educational background, social circles, etc. And that's not to mention we all have different cognitive styles that influence how we learn, process information, and articulate ourselves. And these differences present real opportunity because they allow us to be made aware of or to consider things in a way that we might not have done if we just approached something on our own. So difference in perspective is really, really valuable and can help make our considerations and thinking much more holistic. So you will be pleased to know that is the end of the content for today. So I just want to do a quick recap of what we've covered, because we've covered quite a lot in a very short period of time. So we've touched on the equalities legislation, so protected characteristics and the Equality Act. And we've also looked at NIHR's approach to research inclusion, including our strategy. And then I've taken you through a very brief overview of microaggressions, inclusive language, navigating challenging conversations, bias, and considerations to make working relationships more inclusive. So I hope that this session's been useful for you. If you have any questions after the session and you'd like to discuss any of these topics further, you can get in touch with the development and support team. And their email is developmentandsupport@nihr.ac.uk, or you can also reach out to the research inclusion team at researchinclusion@nihr.ac.uk. The final slide that I'll pop up in a moment and leave there until the end of the session has some links to further resources and reading, and we'll make sure that you're able to get a copy of those links from the development and support team too. So thank you all for watching.